Last time we focused on the Pythagoreans, the first Italian philosophers, in a sense, we had addressed in our course, and we wondered with them about the magic of numbers and the idea of the universe as a cosmos, not as a chaos, as an intelligible unity that can be understood and digged into by our mind and intellect. Today, let's stay in Italy. Let's remain in Italy and talk about a very important philosopher in history who is considered usually the father of metaphysics, a revolutionary philosopher somehow, who for the first time focused at a higher level and directly on the concept of being. His name is Parmenides, and he founded a school called the Eleatic school. The Eleatics are the people from these schools. The most prominent figures as disciples of Parmenides are Zeno and Melissus. And Eleatics are called this way because Parmenides founded this school in a city in the south of Italy called Elea. We saw that Heraclitus took the discussion, the philosophical discussion on nature to the extreme of saying that the only reality is becoming, is the is not, that being not of the change. And if you remember, if you look at change and you see that change, becoming, movement involves not being what you were, right? So I'm a baby here and I'm an adult here, so moving towards the adult, I stop being a baby. So logically speaking, I am not in between these two, right? So I'm a baby, I'm not a baby, and I'm something else here. So he focused on movement as a progress of being not, a progress that movement, a process that can never be stopped, because if you stop it, there is something that is, and it cannot move anymore. So, but that's what we have in nature, is movement. So the reality, the true, and the first principle of everything is precisely movement in the sense of not being. And Parmenides took the other extreme. But in a sense, he was looking exactly at the same thing as Heraclitus. Parmenides said that being is the only thing that exists. Being is and cannot be not, cannot be not. So to him, what was illogical was exactly the idea of change and movement, because it does involve being not. So it's important to understand that Heraclitus and Parmenides are taking two extremes. For one of them, the only reality somehow is the being not of the movement. And so he thought that becoming was the only reality. For Parmenides, what is true is the is, but he is looking at the same reality. He knows that movement involves being not, and by looking at it, he took the other stance. Now, in doing this, he developed for the first time what is called in philosophy the principle of non-contradiction, the idea that things cannot be and not be at the same time. We need to really focus on the logic of Parmenides' argument, because under several respects, his argument is counterintuitive, and his school was very often, let's say, made fun of. I mean, from Plato especially, it appears that they need to defend themselves, because what they say somehow may look silly, because Parmenides wrote a poem in which he writes as inspired by a goddess. I mean, a goddess is telling him what's the wrong way of philosophy, of the search for truth is. And the wrong way is precisely the idea of believing that things can be and not be in the world. And this view involves that change is real. So for him, the whole reality of nature moving and changing, which involves the presence of the is not in the very thing, is an appearance, is not real. Truly, there is only being, which is one, which is unchangeable. It's one being, it cannot be not. And of course, if you look at it this way, it's easy to make fun of them, right? Of them, him and his disciples. And that's why they kind of reacted, trying to make fun of the other, the other side and their critics. So, and we are going to see how they did it. But most importantly, we need to focus on the logic of this, because, in a sense, things might sometimes look funny to logical reasoning and science, but they don't have to. I mean, because we really need to take seriously our intellect. To some people in ancient times, it seemed funny to think that the earth was round, because they thought, wow, this is ridiculous. So what? When you are the other side, you're upside down, don't you fall down? If it is round, I mean, you are the other side, you fall, right? So, in a sense, from a certain viewpoint, it does seem strange, and people might make fun of the idea that the earth is round. But, we need to always look at the rationale of some statements. And the Parmenides statement is pretty strong, logically speaking. So what's the logic? Let's review it again. So if movement, change, becoming involves a transition from is to is not, so you should visualize it just writing down is in point A, and then is not in the middle, and another is in point B. For example, baby, adult. So, but what does is not mean? So, is not is not. Can you think of something that is not? Can you know something that is not? Can it be? Of course, if it is not, it cannot be. If it is not, you cannot know it, you cannot think of it, it cannot lead to any other thing, because it's not, doesn't exist. Try to make it even more interesting, just to get a logical insight about it. Can you think of an elephant that is not? Now you might think, oh, okay, I can think of an elephant that does not exist. I make it in a novel, for example. I write about an elephant, I call it whatever, Pippo, and this elephant does not exist. Or I think of an elephant that dies. But this begs the question, because the point is that we are trying to figure out if it makes sense to think that the movement, the dying of the elephant is real. Maybe it's not. It's like the earth being round or not. Back to what you can think. If the elephant is not, how can you think of the elephant being not? If the elephant does not exist, there is no way you can think of the elephant. So technically you cannot think of something that is not, because if it is not, you wouldn't even know it. So it's not, you cannot think of it. What you think is the elephant. Then you made some kind of thought experiment, but the elephant still remains exactly the same thing in your mind. Whether you predicate the elephant as is or is not, it's like playing with words, because the truth is that the elephant is the elephant in your mind. And you couldn't have it in your mind if it didn't exist. So again, if we have elephant in point A, and it involves is not in the middle, how can you reach point B? How can you cross over from point A to point B if in the middle there is not? I mean, there is not. There is nothing. So you cannot bridge. You cannot build a bridge here, because clearly you need an is in between. But logic wants that the change involves the is not. But hey, Parmenides would say, how can you say that is not is the real reality? Because is not cannot be. So is not, you cannot logically predicate is not of anything, because it's not. You cannot even think of it and name it. So is the only reality. But if is the only reality and cannot go through a movement, I mean, there are a lot of consequences that follow. And that's why Parmenides' school, focusing just on the properties of being as such, at this metaphysical, but starting with an epistemological problem related to the concept of change. This is very important. It's not just a fancy thought experiment. They started exactly as Heraclitus did, with focusing on the dynamic of change and the logical implication of change. And they reached different conclusions. But I would say that, logically speaking, Parmenides is going a little bit further than Heraclitus, even though this dispute somehow characterized the history of philosophy, even in the centuries to follow. But focusing just on the concept of being, Parmenides and his disciples drew some conclusions that belong to what eventually became the philosophy of God, trying to understand how God's being would exist. They said that the being is eternal, for example. And clearly it has to be, right? Because if it doesn't change, if the is what cannot be not, of course it cannot have a beginning and an end. So since it doesn't have a beginning and it doesn't have an end, it's also infinite, because it cannot have an end. It cannot terminate. And it's incorruptible, unchangeable, because corruption is a changing process. And it's one, because if there were two of them, the other would be a limit. So if it cannot have a limit or an end, it has to be one. It's without body too. It's an amazing statement here. But body involves a division in parts, and different parts would deny the other attributes. So these are just examples. I don't want to focus on these metaphysical conclusions, even though they are extremely interesting for the entire history of philosophy. I just want to stress the reason why Parmenides has been, in a sense, the father of metaphysics, and why he was led to this conclusion about changing being impossible. This would be the true path that the goddess revealed to Parmenides, that the is and cannot be not, which is the first formulation in history of the principle of non-contradiction. Think about this principle. If things could be and be not at the same time, you couldn't even know, for example, a chair or the elephant we already mentioned. Why? Because at the same time could be and be not. So it could be an elephant, or it could be a lion, or it could be another thing, because it could be a not elephant, but a not elephant would be something else, right? So you couldn't have any knowledge and any consistent understanding of anything, because every conclusion may be different than the premises, and so you couldn't technically know, think and speak if things could be and not be at the same time. But since they are, we can name them and talk about them. And this is what Parmenides thought it was the case with the concept of being. But he took it to an extreme, and this way he lost somehow the reality of this world as changing. So the whole world became an appearance, even though it was an appearance they could deal with somehow. The doxa in Greek is what appears to our senses. But his philosophical conclusions were definitely that change and movement was an appearance. So at this point we have a big moment in which philosophy doesn't know where to go. We have Heraclitus on the one hand, according to which being is not the reality, and on the other side, on the other hand, we have Parmenides, who says that the only reality is being. That means that change and becoming is an appearance. So we need some other philosophers to, solve this situation, but clearly the answer is not in Parmenides, so I don't anticipate how other philosophers following can solve this issue. I just want to make this a little bit more interesting, mentioning how one of Parmenides' followers, Zeno, tried to defend their views, making fun in turn of their, critics. So Zeno worked out what has been famously called in history a series of paradoxes that are supposed to show that movement or change is impossible and illogical. And they're extremely clever. He's considered, in a sense, the father of dialectical arguments that try to show that you're right by showing that your opponents are stating something that does not make sense. So it's called an argument of disprove or by refutation. So by disproving your enemy's position, you prove that your own is right somehow. So let's see how he developed several of them, and some of them are more focused on criticizing the idea of a multiplicity of beings, and some of them are just focused on motion as such. So in this class I'll just mention two of them. One is from dichotomy, paradox by dichotomy, and the other is also very famous, is from Achilles and the Tortoise, the very slow animal. So the one from dichotomy says that it's impossible to reach an end in movement, because if you try to reach a certain point, first you should reach the half distance between where you are now and where you want to be. But then you need to reach the other half distance from where you are in the second moment and your destination, and then the other half and the half and the half. But you can cut in half this distance to the infinite, and you will never reach the point where you are going to. So if movement shows you that you are actually reaching your destinations while moving, movement is an appearance because it's not logically possible. The argument from Achilles and the Tortoise works pretty much the same way. So let's imagine that Achilles, the famous Greek mythological hero, is chasing a tortoise, this extremely slow animal. But by the time Achilles reaches the place where the tortoise were, even though the tortoise is so slower, the tortoise would have gone a little bit further, and then when Achilles reaches the other point, the tortoise would be further again, and each time, even though Achilles would get closer, he would never get exactly to the point where the tortoise is, because the tortoise will still be in motion. So how can Achilles reach the tortoise if it has to go through infinite points between him and the tortoise? So these paradoxes have been, extremely famous in the entire history of philosophy, and there are some solutions that came after Zeno's, and some mathematicians claim that there is a mathematical solution to these paradoxes, and that's not my field, so I don't mention these solutions. But Aristotle built up a different criticism for these paradoxes, but that would involve explaining the entire way in which Aristotle moved away from Parmenides' view, and this is not for this class. Aristotle himself, while talking about the way in which things are generated in nature, thought that Parmenides doesn't really fit with the other philosophers, because through this metaphysical shift he moved away from the discussion about the way in which things are generated and moved to other things. So, and this would be for another class. Thank you.